So right now we're about a week out from the release of the next Opeth album, The Last Will and Testament, which promises a return to the death metal style growling that they abandoned after the album Watershed, thus making this the first Opeth album since 2008 to really contain the full range of styles that they're capable of. And this does feel like an event, right? And I wanted to mark that event by advancing an argument, which is that for about 10 years in the late 90s and the early aughts, Opeth were the last truly great band in the history of the arc and decay of the rock music tradition. So what do I mean here by a great band? I mean a band that did something that was unimaginable beforehand but seemed inevitable in retrospect. A band in which every element of the music is doing something new and distinct. And a band in which, while their stylistic choices are brilliant and distinct, the intangible qualities of the writing and performance are also excellent in an individual way over and above the idea of the style. Obviously, Opeth don't have the commercial profile of a Black Sabbath or a Led Zeppelin or even somebody like King Crimson, because the nature of their style is self-limiting both in terms of its heaviness and its complexity. And they weren't going to be as influential as those bands, partly because of that stylistic extremity, but also, because they came along at the tail end of the period when any new ideas or information were really going to filter into the larger bloodstream of rock music. But those facts make it more impressive that they were able to accomplish something artistically that stands with the artistic accomplishment of those bands. So what made Opeth great? Well, there was already some established sympathy between metal and progressive rock, going back to artists like Watchtower, crystallizing, of course, with Dream Theater, who are also indisputably a great band, despite only having like 3 albums that I actually enjoy listening to. What Opeth did was not so much just to combine progressive rock and death metal, which, in a way, I think is kind of overrated as a description of what they did. They took some of the underlying values of progressive rock, but most of their music up until that Watershed era doesn't necessarily minute-to-minute sound that much like most prog rock. What they did do was take the most uncompromised version of extreme metal, something sonically in line with what like Morbid Angel or Deicide had been pioneering just a few years earlier, and added dramatically greater levels of complexity and elegance to the riff writing, combined that with incredibly delicate acoustic playing and clean singing that were just as intricate, just as elegant, and that had pride of place as a key part of the song. And I think it's also underrated how singular the drumming made them, right? I know people who think of Orchid and Morning Rise as the best Opeth albums, and I get where they're coming from because they do have a very specific atmosphere, but beginning on My Arms, Your Hearse, you have remarkably fluid and syncopated drumming that totally sheds the rigid martial quality that defined metal starting in the thrash era, and to some extent even before that, right? So in that way, they're reclaiming something like Black Sabbath had done, where Bill Ward's drumming has a flexibility and a jazziness that was almost immediately squashed out as the genre began evolving. So the result then is, on albums like My Arms, Your Hearse, Still Life, Blackwater Park, something that pushes the possibilities of rock music in every conceivable direction, right? You have the greatest possible amount of hardness and softness, both performed with equal adeptness. You have a very distinct melodic and compositional sense which privileges beauty even in the context of heaviness. And you have songs that move through ideas in a way that transcends both a conventional verse, chorus, verse setup, but also something more like Dream Theater, where it's like verse, chorus, verse, 10 minutes of instrumental wank, coda, right? Their song structures made intuitive sense, at least, starting with the 3rd and 4th albums, while still not ever really fitting into an easy template for the structure of a song. And then you have a rhythmic fluidity from Martin Lopez's drumming that maximizes the sense of expression and texture that you can get in what's still basically a bass guitar drum lineup. So to me, something like Still Life, Blackwater Park, those are albums that represent the last time that any band was able to make something that felt like it pushed into genuinely new frontiers, that expanded the range of what the music could be into possibilities no one had really tried before. Obviously, there are other bands doing similar things around the same time. Crimson by Edge of Sanity has a lot of stylistic overlap, but what Opeth did was to maximize each of those areas of the music in a really distinct way. And beyond that, at the most basic level, it took death metal, which up until then was a musical form that was explicitly preoccupied with the glorification of ugliness, and ran it through an aesthetic filter that gave the highest possible privilege to beauty. And the result of that felt like nothing else in the world. You know, it's hard to describe now what it felt like being an Opeth fan during that time. I bought Blackwater Park when I was 17, a couple of months after it came out, around the same time that most of the world started to become aware of Opeth. And for the period after that album was released, particularly the period in between that and the release of Deliverance and Damnation, when everyone in the world of extreme metal fandom was falling in love with it, going back and tracking down some of that earlier work that had been lost up until then, or ignored, it just felt like, this is what I've been waiting for, right? As a kid who had grown up being obsessed with music that was made 10 or 20 years before I was born, this was the first time I felt like I was there for the cutting edge. It's also the last time that it made sense to have a favorite band that were an overwhelming dominant favorite that I felt totally unambiguous about investing myself into and identifying with. I loved a lot of music in those days, of course I still do, and in fact that, the late teens, early 20s explosion into the world of death metal, black metal, that was one of the great periods of music discovery in my life, one of the times when it felt like there were infinite worlds left to discover. But at the same time, it was clear that Opeth was it. And I don't think I was the only person who felt that way, even though it's hard for me now to find any record on the internet of how profound that feeling was at the time. I spent a lot of time in those days reading music reviews on the internet, probably more so than at any other time in my life before or after. And the obscurity of it made it all the more exciting, right? The sense that this was the future of music, literally the best thing going, and only we knew. It was a great feeling, but, more than that, it was the last time that we could all have felt like that, right? The last moment before the possibility of true exploration was lost in the exhaustion of every permutation of rock. Opeth, from the late 90s up until the early 2000s, basically from My Arms, Your Hearse through, give or take, Watershed, were the last band that you could say were the best band in the world, and have that feel like a legitimate, defensible statement. The first time I did psychedelic mushrooms, I spent nearly the whole trip thinking about the release of the next Opeth album, which at that time would have been Ghost Reveries, though I didn't know the title then. Spinning that anticipation up into like a complicated set of philosophical ideas about the relationship between beauty and time. I bought it on release date. I spent days listening to nothing else. And that really, I think, marked the climactic point of that period, probably both for me and the fandom at large. So what happened? Well, time passes, right? Even the best ideas exhaust themselves. Between 2001 and 2006-ish, I listened to Opeth in a more repeated, concentrated, obsessive fashion than I've ever listened to any one artist since then. And, inevitably that had a blanching effect, right? It made the music permanently over-familiar. It stripped it of its power. And I began paying a lot more attention to lyrics as I got older, rediscovering new layers of nuance and feeling in lyrics to songs I'd known for years. And, I did realize that lyrics are maybe the big weak link in the Opeth catalog, or at least the least strong link. They're almost never noticeably bad, the lyrics, but they either take conventional metal themes and dress them up in incongruously fancy language, or they just kind of occupy space without really saying much. When Watershed came out, I bought that on release date too, but the lineup was changing, and you could hear that they were getting tired of being the same band, that they were running from that tiredness by by quitting in the case of two of the members, but then also by bringing in more explicit tributes to other influences and styles, right? When you've single-handedly invented a genre, then growing more eclectic necessarily means growing less distinct. And For me, it felt childish to be so devoted to one artist. It felt like a relief to stop waiting for them to fall off and just kind of decide that they had, to demote them to one favorite among many. And I say that partly about myself, and I think in a way partly about the whole community of people who were fans at that time. And of course, the albums, the clean vocal only neo-prog albums they've done since Watershed, those are listenable, those are great in their way, but they don't have that same sense of total distinctiveness, nor really the kind of power that the heavy stuff had. And yet, with more time and distance, I really have come to understand, to appreciate how singular that experience was. How I'll probably never again have that feeling of being one of the few people who were privy to one of the great artistic achievements of the time that I was living in. How the great, astonishing gobs of every sort of music that I've ingested since then, that sounds more suggestive than I meant for it to, those great gobs of music have, if anything, increased my conviction of the remarkable power and innovation of what Opeth were doing in that run of classic albums, in the things that they did with that classic lineup of Akerfeldt, Lindgren, Mendez, Lopez. It's the last time I felt that way, but more than that, I think it might be the last thing, at least in the world of music as I experience and understand it, that deserved to spur that feeling. Welcome back, everybody. I've been away from the channel for a while because I have a new album that I've been working on finishing up. I'm going to try to review Last Will and Testament in a week or so when it comes out. Maybe if I feel like it, also follow that up with another video kind of talking about where it sits in the catalog, maybe like a quick Opeth album ranking, even though that's not the most original idea in the world. And yeah, I don't know if I'll be uploading regularly, but, sooner or later I'll have the new album done and I'll probably be back more definitively at that point. Thanks very much for listening. If you remember the feeling in 2001, 2002, 2003 that Opeth were the best band in the world at that moment, hit me up in the comments. Let me know that I didn't just imagine it. And I'll talk to everybody later.